Well, good morning. This is Patrick at Qdabra, and I want to welcome you to our weekly webinar. We do these webinars every Thursday. It's about 20 minutes, short, hopefully informative to you, and we're here to talk about forms in SharePoint. Today's topic is how to query large lists and big data. And I'll be going through, I've got two demos for you today. We're actually going to do a part 2 of this in a week because I couldn't get the third demo to work, but I've got two demos for you this morning. And today we are talking about querying data. You've got forms in SharePoint. You've got the need to query lists. Sometimes those lists can be very large. 365 has some limits around those lists. In fact, if we take a look at our first demo, I've got a SharePoint site here, and I want to show you one list I created yesterday that has 42,522 items. So I'm going to be showing you how we can query that list in your forms. Out of the box, doesn't work. I'll talk why in a minute here, but that's the what for today. We're going to show you some tricks. There are two techniques right now for querying large data, and then the third technique will be next week. So those are the three options. We're going to query a large list with an index filter using just stock InfoPath browser form. We're going to show you how you can include your data in the form template itself and query it. This is useful in some situations where you exceed even the large list limits in SharePoint. SharePoint actually scales to quite a few, 50,000 or more items, but there comes a time when it just doesn't scale, and there's actually a couple things you need to watch out for when you're dealing with the first technique that can prevent you from using it, and that's why we have the second technique, because you've got a backup plan there. You can use the data as a resource file in your form. The third technique we'll talk about next week, and we do have this set up. We have several customers using Azure now, and they're basically using Azure to both store and query large sets of data, and we have demos for that. I didn't quite get all my demo working last night on our test site, so appreciate your patience there. We'll look at that next week, but we've got quite a bit in store for this week here. So the first technique, and I'll go through and demo this here now in a second, but the idea is you're going to create a large list, and the easiest way to do that in SharePoint is to simply go into your site contents here, and you're going to create a new, you're going to add an app, and your app is going to be from Excel. So you're going to basically create a list from Excel. So if you search for Excel, you'll see that option there to import your spreadsheet. So, and I use this option because a lot of data is stored in Excel spreadsheets. You can query a database and pull thousands and thousands of records into Excel, and then you can upload them to your SharePoint site, your 365 site, or SharePoint 2013. This is the technique you're going to use. And when you do that, it's going to prompt you for a spreadsheet. Now, what I did yesterday in preparation for this demo is I actually downloaded a large zip code database. So this is my zip code XLSX file here. And you can see that at the bottom, I've got 42,523 rows minus the header. That means that's 42,522. It's just what we saw in the SharePoint list a moment ago. Now what I've done is I've uploaded this data. Now the key thing when you're uploading data is, and let me just go to that list. The key thing you need to watch out for is the index size. So the threshold for the view is 5,000. And if you want to query this list, you need to make sure you set an index. We talked about this many webinars ago, briefly touched on it. But in the SharePoint List Settings UI, you can see here I've got a link for index columns. And I've got one column indexed. Now, you have to be a little bit careful here because there are some scenarios where it will not let you create a new index. And you can see here that, here's the indexes I can create, and those are my fields from my database. But it doesn't let me create a secondary column. The data is just too large. Anyway, actually, that's not true. I created it using a single index to begin with. So if I select another index, I'm guessing that it will give me, it may not give me this. Here we go. So you can get the second column as well. But the second column is not going to give me those primary fields I want. So it's only going to give me the metadata that's stored in SharePoint list by default. So you can create an index. Now here's the problem. If I try to create an index now with a different item, it is going to fail. And the reason for this is that it's beyond the administrator limit of 20,000 items. So there's quite a few little caveats here when you're dealing with large lists. The first thing is if you have more than 5,000 items, you've got this this view limit setting. And what I recommend you do is take a look at this document here. Go into your list setting, and you'll see here, learn about managing a large list. And this is a really nice resource Microsoft has prepared that talks a little bit about the reasons for why they restrict the list size. And I've included a reference in my presentation that I'll be sending you at the end of the webinar. And you can scroll down here. But and it talks about 50 million, so you've got quite a lot of room to grow. But here's some problems here. So there's a 5,000 limit for your views. They try to explain why that is. They go down here and then they talk about other limits. So you've got this unique permissions limit is now 50,000, and that used to be 5,000. So that's good to see they've extended that. But here's the issue that just came up. So when you're an administrator, you can't go beyond 20,000. So you need to index your list before it hits 20,000, or else you're not going to be able to create another one. At least that's my experience. I'm not sure why that is, but I was able to do this yesterday, and while I was uploading the 42,000 zip code list, I actually just went in parallel and created the index for city, and it worked just fine. So my recommendation would be to upload a few items. Maybe you just start the upload process, go back to your list, create the index, and then the upload process will continue from the Excel side. Excel will continue uploading all of those items into your list. As long as you index it before it hits a number, you'll be able to do that. And that's what I did, was I created an index on city. Okay, so now let's take a look at the form technique. So that's the list. Now we have a form. Let me just show you this form working. So this is our large list form here. And I've created a browser form and info path. Very simple sample that I'll include in the webinar. So here it is. Didn't remove the ribbon or anything. This is just a really simple form. Now I've got to show you this technique, the form, and I'll show you the form in the designer in a second. There's a couple fields we're going to query, and it's going to return back any list item that matches. And you can see here I've got a table down here underneath the query results that's going to show us those items. So now, if I search for the zip code, which is not indexed as we just saw, and I click on query, it's going to throw an error. And it's going to tell us, hey, sorry, beyond the list threshold, can't do it. And this is an error that you may have seen. And this is one of the reasons why you may have come to this class, this webinar today. Now what's interesting is that if I query the index column, you'll see that we actually get results back. And it's fairly quick, right? We get 42,000 items in the list. And I can even refine it further. I can do a double thing. I can do, as long as I'm querying with one of the index filters, I can actually query it just fine. I've included some notes here. Number one, though, is it has to have an index, and you have to create your data connection. Well, let's take a look at the form. Once again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to throw those questions in the questions arena, and we'll take a look at those in a moment. So here's the simple form. Now, if you look at the data connection, this is 2010 InfoPath. So 2010 InfoPath still publishes just fine browser forms to 365, and I'm using this today because my 2013 VM died last night, but actually because a lot of our customers, a lot of you still have 2010. So you can see here that it does work just fine with 365. Here's my data connection to my zip codes list. And if you take a look, let's take a look at this data connection. This is just a stock list data connection. and you can see here I'm just pulling in the zip codes. I'm pulling in zip codes, the city and the state, just those three, actually 4 values with the ID. And the key thing here is I'm not retrieving it on open. So make sure you uncheck it. It's checked by default. Make sure you uncheck this, or else your form won't even open. It'll complain that you're beyond the limit. So you definitely want to uncheck that when you set your data connection. That's the first real takeaway here. The second thing is you have to use a filter. So how do we do that? When I click on this button, I've got a rule that is setting my parameters in my query data connection. And so you can see here I'm setting this city parameter in my secondary data source. This is the secondary data connection I just set up. You can see that the background yellow, that indicates it's not the main data source. And I'm selecting city, and I'm setting it equal to the city in the form. This is just my main data source here. You can see the white background. So, and that's the key thing, is you always want to set the city or whatever index column you have. And in this case, we're setting both of them, and then we go off and we query the data connection to get the values. So that's how simple it is. Very simple form, works just fine in the browser, as you saw. And the key thing is that you have to index it, and you have to use the index column when you're querying it. Works just fine, large lists. So that's the first demo. Any questions on that? While we're asking you for questions, I have a quick poll that I forgot to show at the very beginning of this. And just one poll, one question. And of course, I should have asked this at the beginning. So we'll get the data here, though. Its question is really, do you have any large list that you want to query? And appreciate your feedback, your quick feedback here. It looks like we've got about half of you responding. Everyone is saying yes. Oh, a couple of you are saying maybe now. Okay, we'll shut it down in 2 seconds, and thank you very much for playing the poll. Okay, so let's go on to our next slide. And I am taping this, so we will be sending you this video as well as part of the package for today's webinar. A very short 4-question survey at the end, and we'll send the package out. Okay, so let's get back to my presentation. Okay, so that's option number 1. Once again, we create the large list from Excel. We add the index column before it reaches 20,000. We add the query to our form, make sure it doesn't query on load. Make sure we use the index column. And it just works just fine. I've included a reference in here to that document I showed you earlier, and you'll be able to do that quite easily. Okay, so the next technique. So let's say, for example, that you didn't get the index set in time, or your data is so large that for whatever reason you're having a hard time setting the index, and you can't re-upload the data, because one of the problems with option 1 is it does take quite a bit of time to upload this data. It's not too bad. It's, yesterday I did it in about 30 minutes, but it is kind of a ka-chunk process when you're uploading that data from Excel. So there's another option, and this is the option to include the data in your form. And so what you're going to do here is you're going to take that Excel document, you're going to create an XML file, and you're going to use that in your form template. Now, as we all know, InfoPath is an XML editor. So InfoPath loves XML. So, and Excel is an XML editor as well. So in Excel, what you can do is you can take that large list that you've got, and you can add an XML map to it. You see on the right here, I've got my XML source. You're telling me, hey, I've never seen that. Right, so if you've never seen the XML mapping in Excel, you have to go into File Options, and you have to actually add the option to your ribbon. Right now, so you see this little option right here on the right underneath Developer. This Developer tab is usually not checked by default. So you'll have to check that, and then when you check that, you'll see this Developer tab. And when you have the Developer tab open, you can go in here and you can add an XML map. And the way you do that is you just click Add, and you specify an XML map. Now let's say you're saying, well, what's an XML map? How am I going to add XML? Well, the easiest solution is just to simply use InfoPath. So I have a very simple InfoPath form that I created. Let me just see if I can open up the InfoPath form here. Well, try this again. So I just went into InfoPath Designer and I created a very simple form here without any view. I just created the data source. And you can see here on the right, I've got zip codes, zip code, zip, city, state. Very simple, and this is what I want to use for my map. So you just go into InfoPath Designer and you just go down here to click on your add fields and you just create a data source. And then what you do is you go into File, Publish, Export Source Files. And you give it a location, you export the data, and then what you do is you go back to Excel and you say, okay, then go search for that data. And because InfoPath saved the data, so here's the data here I'm using. In this case, I'm using sample data. And you just click on sample data from that form that got exported as source files, and you can use it as your sample map. So it's very easy to use InfoPath to create these simple maps, and then it will infer the schema based on that. And you can see here it's exactly the same as you saw in that form. And then what you do is you right-click on these items in the map, and you just say Map Element, and then you select. It'll prompt you, and you can select the column. Now, once you've done all the mapping, then all you have to do is save the file. So you just save it as XML, and you can see here I've already done that. But if you save it as XML data, we can just make it XML mapped number 2 here. And now you've saved all of your data. It prompts you, it says, wait a minute, you're going to miss some stuff. No big deal. Just continue. And it saves that XML mapping to your hard drive, your local disk, whatever. And now what you can do is you can go into InfoPath. So I've got a second form here I'm going to show you. And this form is you're going to add that map to this second form here. So in my data connections here, I have zip codes, but this is not a connection to a SharePoint list. This is a connection to that zip codes data.xml that we just exported from actually I called it something different. I called it data in the previous time I exported this. And the way to do this is, first of all, you want to go into resource files and you want to add it if it's not already there. And then you select it and you'll use that as your XML data source. And here, because it is included in the form, you can definitely load it on load. You can have it in the form by default. Okay, so what does this give us? Well, by including it in the template, if I preview this, you'll see that it's going to quickly allow us to search that zip codes database, and it doesn't really matter if the column's indexed or not. It quickly pulls it up. So if you've got, and this is the entire zip code database for the United States and Puerto Rico. So I don't know where you live, and this is just some random number. Obviously, there's no zip code for that. But I used to grow up in this town, Snohomish. So anyway, any zip code, all 42,000 of them are in there, and they're very quick. You see how quick that was? I typed this in, and of course, there's nothing for 0012, 10089. Nothing for that either. New York, New York. Yes, so it's very, very quick to access that data. Now, how did we do it? Well, there's a little bit of a hint down below here, but let's take a look. So I've talked about this technique before, but there's a really nice trick here. When you're saying the zip code, first off, you can't use a button to query the internal data source. And that's because if you do, it's going to take a long time to query it, because there's 42,000 items. It has to go through the entire list. But there's a really clever technique that you can use to make that look up very fast. And that technique is called filtering with current. And the rule here is called set city and state. And what I've done here is, when the zip code changes, I have a rule that fires in my form, and it's going to set my city field in my main data source equal to the city in my secondary data source, where the zip code, filtering it, where the zip code is equal to current. And I just went in here and I typed in current. The current function, you may not be familiar with, indexes the list and returns the exact row that I'm on. So when it's querying through this 42,000 long list of zip codes, it's just going to return the zip code equal to the current node it's on. Otherwise, it's going to query twice. It's going to go through the whole 42,000 list items, and then it's going to go through it again for every single one. So it's going to be 42,000 times 42,000, which is going to be about 10 seconds. It's fast, but it's not that fast. Here, if we use current, it's lickety-split. It's just boom. You just get the result quickly. So you can take a look at this form. You can use this technique. But like I said, to use current, you have to use it on a rule on your field. You can't use the button because the button has no context in your data source. Okay, so that's the second technique. Let's just quickly recap. So once again, we've created an XML file using Excel and using our Excel mapping technique. And there's a link down below here to explain how to do that. We've added the XML as a resource file to our form and a data connection to retrieve it. We've added a rule to our form to look up the values using the current function. So the benefits of option number 2 are, first off, it's less time to set up. You don't have to wait 30 minutes to an hour or whatever. It's more foolproof. So there are times when uploading 100,000 items to SharePoint doesn't work. So you've got this backup. It also results in a super fast lookup. One big caveat, one big con is I could not get this working in the browser. I could have sworn it worked in the browser a year ago, but for now it's complaining. And let me show you what that looks like in the browser, and then we'll answer some questions. So I've got this other, I need to go to my, actually I was just there. And that was the right location. And so it opens the form and it complains that, hey, it's too big. And it's about a 4 megabyte file, but it's compressed. So the actual XSN is not very large. And I was almost sure that this worked just fine a while ago, but it is no longer working in the browser. Now it does work in the filler, as you saw in the preview. But a lot of times the filler is just not an option for you. So that's the one big drawback right now for this technique. And next week I'm going to be talking about option number 3. Option number 3 is using SQL Azure and a web service. And this is the best option because this allows you both unlimited scalability and it allows you to super fast query time. Just like you saw with the first technique there and the second technique, it's instantaneous. You're using a filter. You can have lists that are 1 million records long. You can also store data in your Azure SQL database. And I'll be showing you a form that does this next week. We'll be talking more about it. Couldn't quite get it working for today's webinar, but we'll do it next week. So that's it for the demos. Do you have any? We have lots of questions. I'm glad that you're asking questions. And like I said, we are taping this. So first question, thank you, Catherine. First question, Catherine says she's got lots of questions about large lists, but have one non-list question. Is Microsoft ever going to open up the metadata service in InfoPath Forms? So the answer is no. However, there is a workaround. You can get at the metadata using QRules. QRules has a function to do it. Unfortunately, it doesn't work in the browser. It only works in the filler. So we do have a few customers using that technique, and I think we have a blog post on it on infopathddev.com. So if you need assistance with that technique, if the filler will work for you, you can query the metadata, and you can map it back to metadata labeled columns so you can get the search to work. We've done this before. It does take an hour or so to set it up. It's not trivial, but it can be done if you're using the filler. Unfortunately, with the 365, those metadata APIs, those web services, are locked down. They are site-wide. Therefore, with the tenant-based 365, you cannot access them. I do believe that it may be possible to get them to work in SharePoint 2013 on-prem if you're using on-prem. But I'm not 100% on that. Second question, also from Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. Large list question. So if you bring a list from a cloud-based server through an external data connection, how does that work with the list? Yeah, so we'll talk about that next week. Basically what you're going to be doing is you're going to be converting that data connection to a universal data connection file. In order to get it to work in the browser, you need to have a UDC file. And then you'll be querying the web service that is getting the data. And you need to make sure you're querying a web service that is enabled anonymously on the internet. Now, of course, you need security, so you need to pass it a token or a key to prevent issues with access and security. So you're going to use a security token. We'll show you how to do that next week. There's a couple different ways to do it. You can set up the secure store to pass your credential. You can also just send a token across the wire, and we'll show you the latter technique next week. And then another question from Catherine. Can the cloud-based server be a shared hosted SQL server like GoDaddy shared hosting SQL server? Yes, it can, but you need to be able to change the properties on those web methods, those access points, to make sure that they're accessible. If you can access your SQL server from your local desktop, then you can access it from 365 with the credentials and the authentication that we'll show next week. And then a question from Ryan. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Ryan. Ryan, there it is. It's early in the morning here. Is there a good hybrid solution for a large amount of data in an XML resource file that needs occasional updates? Yes, that was one of the issues with the second technique here, which is if you have to update it, it's more work. You have to add it back to your form and republish it. Now you can move the XML data externally. You can just put in a document library, and you can access the XML from the document library, and that means that you don't have to republish. But the problem is that if it's really large, there will be a lag on open because it's going to have to pull in that data. So I guess the question here is that's kind of a hybrid for you. You basically move the XML form into a document library, and then you set up your data connection to the document library to pull on open. Not sure that's going to work really well, because if it's large, it's going to cause a lag. If it's all part of the same server, though, it should be fast to open, even if it's several megabytes. But you've got this issue with 365 not letting you open large XMLs now. I don't know if it's 4 megabytes or 3 megabytes, but it used to be just fine, and it works fine as far as I know in SharePoint 2013 on-prem. But for 365, there are some limitations there. Yeah, so I would definitely look at the first technique. I think that's going to be the best for you. But if you need help with that XML file technique, we can help you out. And the idea is, if you've got an XML file, you can just use InfoPath to edit it, right? So you can have an InfoPath form that saves a big XML file in a document library. You can have another InfoPath form that queries it on open, and that's a very common pattern. Yeah, and Catherine, I'm sorry about the fact that the filler won't work for the 365 browser won't work for the metadata. That's kind of where we're at right now. Unfortunately, 365 metadata isn't accessible like it is on the on-prem because of the tenant-based service there. If you've got on-prem, it will work. Clay's got a question. You mapped Excel schemas to InfoPath forms. Is it possible to extract data from multiple repeating tables in lots of records? Yes, we have a technique to do that. We've shown this many times, but the technique, we have a tool. It's called InfoPath to SharePoint List. And you basically install this little tool. It's actually an InfoPath form. And this will allow you to map, basically define a mapping. So you add your InfoPath XSN here, you add your SharePoint list, and you're going to be mapping, your SharePoint site, and you can map the data in your repeating form template to one or more lists. You can extract all that data, and you can use it in those lists. And this tool is part of QRules, and there's a free download. So you could actually just download QRules, install the tool, and get it working, and then you wouldn't have to buy anything, right? You just use the tool in the free trial, and the tool doesn't expire. And then you can do it on batch too. So you define the mapping, and then you run it on a batch. And this is a good technique to use. And and this is very easy to set up. If you need our help, we're here to help you. We do require support tickets if you want to use an hour of our time or more. But there's a lot of people that talk about this on the forum too. Infopathdev.com is a location for you that you can go to get free support. Wonderful. Well, thank you all very much for coming to the webinar this week. Once again, this is Patrick Halsted. I appreciate your quick survey results. We will send out that webinar package. If you can just send me your 4 questions, answers to those 4 questions, I'll send that out in an hour or so with the video link. And hope you guys have a wonderful day. We'll be here again next week. It'll be me again showing you how to query data from Azure, and I look forward to having you all here. Talk to you soon.